So I'll click go live. All right, and we're back to Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus. And we've been discussing the analogy between the ideal state. We're covering that section of the text, or have just covered it, where Socrates adumbrates his remarks from the previous day, where he recounted to Hermocrates, Critias, and Timaeus the events of the Republic, probably, or some other occasion where Socrates reported his account of the ideal state. And we were looking at the parallels between the features of the ideal state and the features of the cosmos. So we are just wrapping that section up. I'll begin with this quote here from Socrates in the text. Have we, therefore, again sufficiently resumed the epitome of the discussion of yesterday, or do we require anything further, friend Timaeus, which has been omitted? Proclus. The resumption of the polity teaches us, through images, how the universe is filled with the most excellent productive powers. For generated natures in it are separated from each other, and each communicating with other things energizes according to its own peculiarity. So this is similar to all is in all, but appropriately in each. He was talking about how divine demiurgic powers, like world-creating powers, also are productive of all, but especially in their appropriate products. So think about astrology, where the net effect on you is a communication of all of the heavenly bodies with each other in their respective positions. So the entire heavens produce the astrological effect they do. And yet you can still isolate out, like, what is the peculiar effect of Mars or Venus based on its, special properties, but the entire productive act is communal. So he related that to the communal property and works of the guardians. Excuse me. And primary, indeed. Jeez. All right, and primary indeed are exempt from secondary natures, yet employ their energies as necessary to the completion of the universe. So primary powers use secondary powers, so like the demiurge of wholes uses the demiurgic triad, and then you use the series of daimons in each of those particular younger god series. So a whole host of secondary and tertiary beings assist in creation, while the superior members remain exempt. As I said before, Proclus emphasizes that exemptness of the superior. Damascius admits more of a back and forth. Numenius, the Middle Platonist, admits more of a back and forth. Plotinus is probably somewhere in between. But secondary are adorned by primary natures. The most excellent, however, of mundane beings are connascently conjoined with the most excellent, middle with middle, and last with such as are last. So just like the guardians in their kind of eugenics regime, the best are meant to breed with the best. So these powers are likewise conjoined in the universe. But the same productive powers pervade through many subjects, and the same recipients participate of many productive powers. Lives also, at different times, have different allotments, according to their desert. All these particulars, therefore, sufficiently place before our view the order of the universe. For in definite heads, Socrates has, in a becoming manner, epitomized every form of the polity, recurring to intellectual impartibility in order that he might imitate the god who adorns the celestial polity intelligibly and paternally. And of course, in the text of the Republic itself, it says that the head of the guardians needs to be capable of a kind of mystic contemplation on the form of the ideal polity. So he does structure the state according to that real archetype. So what grounds the plans of the lawgiver in the ideal polity, what orders that law-giving, is reverting back to its intelligible paradigm. All right. So there's, of course, intelligible justice and then also celestial justice, which would kind of be intermediate, I suppose, between the form of justice and then the instantiated ideal justice of the ideal polity. But since everywhere measures, start that again. But since everywhere measures and perfection are definitely imparted to secondary natures from primary causes, on this account also Socrates requests Timaeus to inform him whether he has comprehended in his epitome every form of the polity. Because Timaeus is seen as a superior character with greater authority, Timaeus, it was said towards the beginning, represents the demiurge of wholes, and then Socrates, Critias, Hermocrates represent the demiurgic triad, which is the intellectual demiurge, the soul demiurge, and then the cosmic demiurge. And I'm sure we will see a lot more on that trinity, demiurgic trinity, later on. For every intellect, being firmly fixed in the deity prior to itself, defines itself by looking to it. So Socrates looks back to the demiurge of wholes as that demiurgic intellect, or representing the demiurgic intellect, to which we may add that to speak summarily is a symbol of the first parts, and the head of the universe being adorned by the fabricator of the heavens, which the demiurge of the universe adorns in a more perfect manner, looking to the whole, and the one life of the world, and thus much respecting the analogy of partial natures to wholes. The investigation, however, is not attended with any difficulty, whether the words mean, quote, have we now epitomized the polity which we discussed yesterday, or have we again epitomized today the polity which we epitomized yesterday? For whether yesterday Socrates spoke more diffusely, but now summarily, or he spoke summarily in both, the divine Iamblichus approves of either of the readings, and we do not at all differ from him. Perhaps, however, the latter construction is more consonant, for again to discuss the polity summarily manifests that it was summarily discussed yesterday, and it is not at all wonderful that the summary discussion which took place in the Republic should not be brought to light, for many other things which are asserted here, as being said on the former day, are not to be found in that dialogue, unless it should be said that the word again does not refer to the epitomizing, but to resuming the discussion, for he resumes, who narrates at great length what had been said before, but he again resumes, who summarily contracts the narration. Okay? But whichever of the constructions is adopted, neither of them is attended with any difficulty. Next quote, Socrates. Hear now, then, how I am affected towards this polity, which we have discussed. Proclus. What Socrates says in the words that follow comprehends, that I may speak summarily, these 5 particulars. First, what that is which in what has been said he desires should take place after the narration of the polity. So, what that he talked about he would want to take place. Secondly, that he is not sufficient to effect this himself. Thirdly, and what he wants to take place is someone to bring the characters to life, basically, so he can see the state in action. Thirdly, that neither is any one of the poets sufficient. Fourthly, that it is not proper to commit a work of this kind to the sophists. Fifthly, that the auditors alone can accomplish that which is earnestly desired by Socrates in a becoming manner. What, therefore, is this? For it is necessary, in the first place, to speak concerning that which Socrates desires to see after this polity, viz., to see, as he says, a city of this kind in motion, engaging in contests and labors and warlike actions, in order that after the peaceful life which he had delivered, he might have to narrate the energies of the city arising from circumstances of times and places. This, therefore, is what he wishes to see accomplished. Someone, however, may doubt to what the desire of Socrates is directed, and on what account he wishes this to be accomplished. Porphyry, therefore, dissolves the doubt by saying that energies perfect habits, not only those energies that are prior to habits, but also those that proceed from them. So, if you have a habit, and that habit energizes in a certain way that perfects the habit, and also your prior energies to your habits, like your you have, dispositions or potentialities prior to particular habits, dunamis, faculties basically, and those energize to create the habits in the first place. So you can see habits are perfected by energies from higher faculties, and also the energies of the habits themselves reflect back and perfect the habit. So that's interesting. For the perfection in habit is a conjunction with energy, since otherwise habit will be in a certain respect incapacity and at rest through remission of energy. Right. And while essence is seen as superior to energy, energy is seen as superior to potency. Energy is like actuality. Essence, though, is a higher form of actuality. Energy is like the particular activity. Essence is what remains eternally real in a thing, no matter what, and is always fully actualized in a way that, mere activity is never actual. In the generated world, things aren't really real because they come and go. So even though something actualizes in the generated world, it's still not the truer form of actuality that the essence of things has. And so that's why it's a problem if a habit remains in capacity and at rest. Okay. Socrates, therefore, although in another sense, what is at rest is seen as superior, but I think not in this particular context, because the essence being eternal is at rest and not moving. Motion is seen as inferior to stability, because motion implies a telos, because you wouldn't move unless there was something to move to, and having a telos outside of yourself implies you are deficient in some regard, because there's some goal outside of yourself that you're seeking. So remaining in yourself is superior. So essences like pure actuality are actually stable rather than motive. But then like a a mundane potentiality is stable in another way, in that it's deficient of the energy, the actuality that it would affect in time. So kind of a fine distinction there between like the good rest and the bad rest. Like matter is immobile in the inferior sense. The one is immobile in the superior sense. Socrates, therefore, in order that he may survey the polity truly perfect, requires that in words it may be beheld in motion, engaged in warlike actions, and contending with others. And it appears, says he, from hence to be manifest that Plato does not admit that the habit of virtue by itself, but when energizing, is sufficient to felicity. Right. So you can't just have a capacity for doing virtuous things, you actually have to do them. It may, however, be said in answer to Porphyry that if the end was military, it would be requisite to assert that war gives perfection to the polity. But if the end of it is peace, what occasion is there to solve Platonic doubts by introducing peripatetic explanations? Or though the end is not military, yet war exhibits the magnitude of virtue in a greater degree than peace, just as mighty waves in a tempest show in a stronger light the skill of the pilot's art. And in short, this is affected by circumstances, as the Stoics also are accustomed to say, quote, give circumstances and take the man. Right? So that's kind of what Plato does with the guardians as well. He has them undergo trials to test them. But that which is not subdued by things which enslave others manifests a life in every respect worthy. If you withstand stuff that takes everyone else down, then you're good. Perhaps, however, it is absurd to refer the cause to these things alone, though they have a political reason, and not to look to the whole scope of Plato, according to which the god who adorns the polity in the heavens is willing also that generation should be governed by the celestial gods, and that the war of forms in matter should always subsist, in order that the circle of generation may adumbrate the celestial circulation. Right. The war between Athens and Atlantis is symbolized in either, intelligible versus sensible, Athens representing the intelligible, Atlantis the sensible, or perhaps the superlunary eternal celestial order versus the sublunar, like world of generation processes of birth and decay. Okay. And this it is to see the city excited to war, to see generation co-arranged with the celestial regions, and the whole of it governed from thence. So this coincidence of opposites of the changing and the unchanging, the war between them constitutes the cosmos also. It appears likewise that this is analogous to what is shortly after said by the demiurge of the universe, quote, that when the generating Father understood that this generated resemblance, the world, of the eternal gods moved and lived, he was delighted with his work. In a similar manner, therefore, Socrates wished to see his city moving and energizing, just as the god who comprehends the celestial polity wished to behold the natures which it contains energizing, and adorning the contrariety produced by generation. Such an analogy, therefore, as this takes place in the present instance. If, however, we arranged before the lower city as analogous to generation, but now as analogous to war, you must not wonder. For the same things may be safely arranged among different things according to different analogies. I feel like he's just like covering his bases, if someone should point that out, that he's using the same bit of text in multiple analogical senses, but that isn't really foreign to Proclus or this period of Neoplatonism. They'll find several levels of meaning in the text, and all of them can be applicable. For generation also, according to the lives in it which are inseparable from matter, resembles the lower city, but according to its contrarieties and material tumult, it is similar to war and warlike dissensions. That we may, however, co-adapt everything to the theory of mundane wholes, prior to the consideration of every particular, let us direct our attention to the second thing said by Socrates, and see how it accords with this theory. For since Socrates is analogous to the first of the three fathers who adorn the first of things, the first of the demiurgic triad, he says he is not sufficient to fashion what follows. For the divinity who gives subsistence to all things is different from him who constitutes things of a middle nature, and this God, again, is different from him who is the cause of things that rank as the third. But the third particular is that neither are the poets sufficient for this purpose, nor in the fourth place the sophists, the former indeed because they imitate the things in which they have been nourished, and so the poets haven't perceived the ideal state, so they don't know it, but the latter because they are wanderers, and not at one and the same time philosophers and politicians. Okay, so being wanderers, that's interesting. They're kind of in that circle of the other, or the column of the indefinite, more towards otherness than similitude. All right. Just checking in. Everything is good. All right. Again, therefore, let us see how these things are conformable to what has been before said. For it is necessary that the powers that are to preside over generation should not be separable from material natures, but conversant with them. So the powers that preside directly over generation can't be imparticipable, but have to be involved. So for Proclus, there's like a spectrum of causation, with the highest cause of a thing, the highest demiurge, being totally exempt, and then intermediate workers will be more and more conversant and involved with the ultimate end product. For these powers are analogous to poets who invent fables, and to imitators. For these are employed about images, alone praise material and partible natures, which they only know, and are unable to ascend from matter. Nor is it fit that these powers should be inseparable and very mutable, at different times ascending or descending to different orders, such as are partial souls, who are assimilated to sophists, because they also possess all beautiful productive powers, but at different times wander to different parts of the world. Hence it is necessary that the powers that connectedly contain generation, which is governed by the heavens, should at one and the same time be philosophical and political, in order that through the philosophic characteristic they may be separate from the subjects of their government, but may energize providentially through the political peculiarity, performing the duties pertaining to their allotments according to intellect. So these powers that connectedly contain generation, we need that middle term that is both exempt in one sense and involved in another sense. Whenever in Neoplatonism you have something with two attributes, say x and y, and another thing with not x and not y, then you're going to have a middle term that is x and not y, or probably also y and not x, unless x and y are rank order attributes where y is dependent on x. But yeah, you get middle terms wherever there are multiple attributes that can be together. Or if one is one, like one is A, another is not A, then you might have a middle term that in some sense is both A and not A, as in the present instance. For that which is physical, being productive, is inseparable from matter. But the form of partial souls, being sophistical, is abundantly wandering. It is necessary, however, prior to things which are moved, that there should be the invariable and perpetually permanent providence of the gods, and immutable prior to mutable allotments. In the fifth place, therefore, Socrates delivers to us who those are that are able to effect this. So not the sophists or poets, but those present. For these things are to be transferred from words to deeds, because the demiurge of the universe and the rest of the fathers fabricate totally and exemply, the second of which fathers gives subsistence to middle, but the third to last natures. And to these, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates are analogous. But of these, the first is praised in an admirable manner, Socrates also adding, in my opinion, but the second in a middle way, conformably to his order, and the third in the last degree, i.e., according to the testimony of others. Okay, but then to set Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates in such a triad is to sort of work against the character metaphor setting that Proclus initially identified, where Timaeus was the demiurge of wholes, and then Socrates, Critias, and Hermocrates were the triad. So now Timaeus is in the triad and Socrates is outside of it, which makes me think probably Plato did not actually have this demiurge and then demiurgic triad character metaphor scheme in mind. But it works for the most part anyway. So, all right, next quote. For I will illustrate the affair by a similitude. Suppose then that someone, on beholding beautiful animals, whether represented in a picture or really alive, but in a state of rest, should desire to behold them in motion, and engaging in some one of those contests which pertain to bodies. Proclus. Longinus says that Plato here decorates and beautifies his diction through similitudes and the gracefulness of the words. But Longinus says this in answer to certain Platonists who contend that this mode of expression is spontaneous and not the result of art. For Plato, he observes, pays attention to the selection of words and does not employ them casually. It may, however, be said that Plato made choice of this form of words from a mode of diction which was at that time common and usual, and that he was very attentive to what was customary. For the atoms of Epicurus would more rapidly, by their concurrence, produce the world than nouns and verbs would form a correct sentence by a casual composition. But some blame Plato for employing metaphors in the use of words, though with respect to composition all admire him. At the same time, however, it may be inferred, not from this circumstance alone, but from such care and industry as are exhibited in the present words, that he paid great attention to diction. For Socrates does not simply say that he desires to see this accomplished by those that were with Timaeus, but he speaks like one decorating his words and alluring the hearer when he says, "For I will illustrate the affair by a similitude. Suppose that someone on beholding beautiful animals, whether represented in a picture or really alive, etc., and thus much for Longinus. Origen, however, grants indeed that Plato is attentive to the grace of diction, not as regarding that which is pleasing as the end of it, but that he employs this image for the sake of exhibiting the manner in which he was himself affected. And we say that this similitude was written for the sake of the imitation of divine natures." So when he says, "if we say," is he now addressing himself and Syrianus and moving to his own doctrine? I expected him to go on longer about Origen, but looks like he's talking about his own opinion here, which is always going to follow Syrianus, pretty much. "And we say that this similitude was written for the sake of the imitation of divine natures." Right, okay. So Longinus pays attention to the kind of rhetorical appeal of the phrase. Origen, that Plato is careful in his diction to express his own state or desire. And then here, Proclus, Syrianus say, no, the way he's speaking here carefully with his diction, maybe the other two apply as well, but it's primarily for the imitation of divine natures, so we have to look for the metaphor. Okay. That the grace of the words present to us, an image of the grace imparted by the demiurge to celestial natures, and that the artifice of the diction, which is mingled with the spontaneous, adumbrates divine production, which has indeed a boundary from itself, and also a progression from being and essence. Okay, so the spontaneity of the words, the kind of casualness, seeming casualness, reflects the mode of divine production, which has a boundary from itself, and so in that sense is kind of arbitrary in some way. But when we talk about self-producing beings, autopoietic beings, which is used like in modern philosophy in a different sense, but the term is like literally autopoietic for Proclus, self-perfecting beings or self-causing beings, they're not absolutely self-causing. And when he says that a divine production has its boundary from itself, that means its essence is self-substantial and inevitable and divinely necessary. But that doesn't imply that each god is wholly unrelated and uninfluenced by the orders above him, right? Like all of the various intelligible gods will be inferior to divine necessity, Ananke, and are caused in a way by Ananke necessity and by the one and the good at the highest level. They're all lower things are caused and limited in some sense, but there's a distinction between natures or essences that are self-complete and they themselves are necessary beings, and then generated natures that don't have necessary essences, and so in that sense don't have essences in the true sense, like a bodily thing, a table, a chair, whatever, doesn't have like an absolutely necessary essence. It's a little bit more ad hoc, random in the way that it's assembled. So I think that's what he means, just to clarify that potentially. Divine production has its boundary from itself, that is from its own nature, but the nature that it has is still necessary, bound by necessity anyway. If likewise you direct your attention to the image itself, beautiful animals manifest those natures that are resplendent with divine beauty, but those represented in a picture or really alive indicate corporeal images and true lives prior to these imitations. but the figures of the gods are resemblances of the animals that are in them. Okay. But those that are in a state of rest exhibit to us the natures that are full of intellectual arrangement and of an equable and continued life. Those that are in motion, such as proceed into another order and a second fabrication, and those which engage in some one of the contests pertaining to bodies, are images of those that impart to more imperfect natures their own proper effluxions and powers, and operate by their own powers on other things, and thus much respecting the image. But the words, whether represented in a picture or really alive, are rightly asserted in both respects of divine bodies. Okay, so some of this interpretation, I don't know, may also be slightly dubious, or, you know, we don't have to fully agree. It seemed like he was saying that the pictures that are mentioned, the figures of the gods are resemblances of the animals that are in them. Okay, in fact, before I just dismiss what Proclus is saying, let's read it more carefully. So we're going to read this section again. If likewise you direct your attention to the image itself, beautiful animals, so to the phrase itself, I guess, beautiful animals manifest those natures that are resplendent with divine beauty, and those represented in a picture or really alive, seems like he's talking about two different entities, but they symbolize both corporeal images. Okay, so he lists two different things that they're representing. So represented in a picture, corporeal images, and then really alive, the true lives prior to these imitations. That's fine. For the figures of the gods are resemblances of the animals that are in them. That sentence I don't really understand. But okay, I mean, in the metaphor, I don't want to work too hard on trying to understand this passage. I'm not sure exactly what he means with this sentence, but those that are in a state of rest exhibit to us the natures that are full of intellectual arrangement. Yeah, so real animals in a state of rest, he indicates, is full of intellectual arrangement and of an equable and continued life, which is the superior order. But then Socrates doesn't necessarily treat the animals, the real animals that are in a state of rest, as superior. He wants to see them moving, but I guess it doesn't, there's nothing to preclude the reading of the animals in a state of rest as representing the higher intellectual orders that remain in themselves. So, okay. And then those that are in motion, such as proceed to another order and a second fabrication, and those which engage in some one of the contests pertaining to bodies. So we have, in motion is the general next step after the stable, and then after general motion, we have particular contests, images of those that impart to more imperfect natures their own proper effluxions and powers, and operate by their own powers on other things. So yeah, just more general to more specific, inferior or descending grade of quality, but all of which are necessary to bring the whole thing to life, and thus much respecting the image. Okay. But the words, whether represented in a picture or really alive, are rightly asserted in both respects of divine bodies. Okay. For they are depicted by the dodecahedron, and they possess efficacious and demiurgic lives. If, however, you consider the words separately, they will signify that the before-mentioned polity is indeed fashioned in words and is assimilated to the heavens, but exists, if not in human, yet in true or daimonical lives. Farther still, to desire to see the city in motion is analogous to the words in another part of this dialogue, quote, as soon as the Father saw the universe moving, he was delighted and wished to assimilate it in a still greater degree to its paradigm. End quote. For thus also the adorner of the heavens wished to see them in motion, and through motion governing the war of generation. But the words engaging in some one of the contests pertaining to bodies are employed because of contests Some belong to souls, but others to bodies, and the latter are such as running, wrestling, and gymnastic. Okay. There was we have a chat in the Jitsi call, which is typically where we run these reading groups. Tomer, figures of the gods could be picture or statue of the gods, could show resemblance not to the gods in themselves, but to their instances in animals. Yeah, I did think that, but we're talking in this passage about the interpretation of Socrates mentioning, if you see an animal, a picture of an animal or a real animal resting there, then you're going to want to see its activities to know like its full capacities and its true nature. So it would just be kind of out of place. I think maybe not to insult Thomas Taylor, but maybe that particular sentence wasn't translated in the clearest way. And by the way, anyone in the Jitsi call, feel free to jump in with any remarks or questions or anything like that. Okay, next quote. In such a manner am I also affected towards the city which we have discussed. For I should gladly hear any one relating the contests of our city with other cities, when it engages in a becoming manner in war, and acts during such an engagement in a way worthy of its education and discipline, both with respect to practical achievements and verbal negotiations. Proclus. We have before shown through what cause and with reference to what paradigm Socrates wished to see his republic contending in war, because cities, however, employ against their enemies both works and words indeed in embassies, in compacts, in exhortations to battle, and in everything of this kind, but works in the pitching of camps, in spears, and the hurling of missive weapons. On this account, Socrates wishes that a city of this kind should be celebrated according to both these, in words indeed as prudent, cautious, magnanimous, and strenuous, but in deeds as brave, vehement, and well exercised. For thus, according to both, it will imitate its paradigm, who, shining with physical and intellectual productions, adorns all the war of generation. Next quote. For indeed, O Critias and Hermocrates, I am conscious of my own inability to praise such men and such a city according to their desert. Proclus. This is the second of the proposed heads, of which we have before assigned the cause, and shall now again explore it according to another method. For now some of the more ancient interpreters, so he enumerated what Socrates was about to say, this is point 2 of his 5. For now, some of the more ancient interpreters have said that the encosmiastic form of... encomiastic. So encomium is like a laudatory speech. The more ancient interpreters have said that the encomiastic form of writing is robust, superb, and magnificent, but the Socratic character of diction is slender, accurate, and dialectic. Yeah, that's... seems like a good interpretation to me, Socrates does give good encomiastic speeches in the Palinode from the Phaedrus, but then even in his speech on love, it's not like the most encomiastic. He kind of like deprecates the subject. Interesting. The latter, therefore, is contrary to the former, so his method is contrary to the method of encomium generally. Hence, say they, Socrates avoids panegyric, as knowing the power he possessed, and the subjects to which it was naturally adapted. So he stayed in his own lane, understanding his limitations. Those, however, who assert this, in addition to their being directly refuted by the Menexenus, why is it the Menexenus? Oh, because it's a dialogue. Yeah, of course. I think that's considered potentially spurious. Menexenus. I think today it's thought not to be Platonic, but let's just, for the trivia, let's just check that. Um, okay, no, it's not doubted, so it's a genuine dialogue. Considered uh, part of a tetralogy with the Greater and Lesser Hippias and the Ion. The Ion is a fun one. The topic of the Menexenus consists mainly of a lengthy funeral oration referencing the one given by Pericles in Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War. Socrates here delivers to Menexenus a speech that he claims to have learned from Aspasia. Okay, so here's an example from the dialogues of Socrates giving a very good panegyric speech. Okay, so, all right. So those who assert this were refuted by the Menexenus itself, but they appear to me not to have perceived the magnificence of the diction of Socrates in the Phaedrus. Right, the other example that I mentioned. There are also those who say it is fit that the artificer of such like encomiums should be skilled in warlike affairs. Hence, many historians err in their disposition of armies through ignorance of tactics. Okay, so because Socrates is addressing the state in conflict, and Socrates isn't an expert in conflict, that's why it's not appropriate for him. But as Proclus is going to refute, but Socrates, having fought at Delos and Potidaea, was not unskilled in all such like particulars. Others again assert that Socrates speaks ironically, just as he said with respect to other things that he was ignorant of them. So here he says that he did not know how to praise this city according to its desert. The irony, however, of Socrates was employed against sophists and young men, and not against wise and scientific men. It is better, therefore, instead of these things, to say that he guards against becoming the third from the truth. For the works of a rightly instituted city are the third from the paradigm of truth, i.e., of the true or intelligible polity. Hence, wishing to remain in the second from the truth, he says he is not able to bear the descent to the third species of life. And an impotency of this kind is an abundance of power. For to be able to abide in paradigms is effected through power which is transcendent. You may likewise see how this accords with what has been said before by us respecting the analogy of these things to wholes. For the second fabrication is assimilated to the first, and on this account is proximate to it. For the whole demiurgic series is one, possessing union together with separation. Very properly, therefore, is Socrates precedenteously extended to Critias and Hermocrates, and he rightly thinks it fit that they should weave together the particulars that are next in order. For Timaeus is about to deliver these things in a more universal and elevated manner, and not through images, in consequence of directly preserving his analogy to the demiurge of wholes, who paints the heavens with the dodecahedron, but generation with appropriate figures. All right, so actually this works fairly well with the Proclean account of the creation of the demiurge, or how the demiurge goes about creating. If Socrates represents the... Okay, so actually it doesn't work quite as well as I thought, but if Socrates is the demiurgic intellect, the creation is affected by Socrates looking back to the superior, and then that looking back, that intellective gathering, is then what gives the seeds for the next phase. So Socrates speaks of something at one level, and then Timaeus speaks of something at a higher level, because the cosmos is the paradigm of the ideal polity. Socrates addressed the archetype of the ideal polity, or the blueprint, rather, like the nature, essence of the ideal polity, as opposed to its activities, which he then asks... I mean, Critias is going to be the one to narrate that, because Critias has the Atlantis story. So, just to get this straight, Socrates gives the nature of the ideal polity. He looks back to Timaeus, who gives the paradigm or archetype on which the ideal polity is based, that is the cosmos. And then that reversion sets the groundwork for, gives the seeds for the further dissemination at then the level of Critias, and we don't know what Hermocrates would have talked about, but presumably it would have fit in somehow. And comments about that method of demiurgic creation can be found in Proclus's commentary on the Cratylus, which is harder to read than this because it was written as lecture notes by one of his students. So Proclus is referred to often in the third person, and it's the same way that Hermias's commentary is written on the Phaedrus, except Hermias is the student writing the notes, and so the Hermias commentary, quote unquote, is really more Syrianus's commentary, who that's the lecture that Hermias was attending, whereas the Proclus commentary was Proclus's lecture written by an anonymous student, mostly, with maybe some like cleaning up by Proclus himself. Some of the modern scholars speculated. Okay, next quote. Indeed, that I should be incapable of such an undertaking is not wonderful, since the same imbecility seems to have attended poets, both of the past and present age. Not that I despise the poetic genus, but it is perfectly evident that the imitative tribe easily and in the best manner imitate things in which they have been educated. But that which is foreign to the education of anyone, it is difficult to imitate well in deeds, and still more difficult in words. This, Proclus, this is the third of the before-mentioned heads of the discussion, in which Socrates shows that none of the poets have been adequate to the praise of men in cities of this kind, which have casually been engaged in warlike actions. Longinus, however, and Origen doubt whether Plato comprehends Homer among the poets when he says that he has not only the same opinion of the poets then existing, for this is nothing novel, but likewise of those of former times, so that Porphyry informs us that Origen passed 3 whole days exclaiming, blushing, and toiling, asserting that the hypothesis and the doubt were great, and being ambitious to show that the imitation in the poetry of Homer is sufficient for virtuous actions. For who speaks more magnificently than Homer, who, representing the gods as contending and fighting with each other, does not err in his imitation, but speaks loftily, conformably to the nature of things? Porphyry, however, in reply, says that Homer is indeed sufficient to give magnitude and elevation to the passions, and to excite actions to an imaginative bulk, but that he is not capable of delivering an impassivity which is intellectual, and which energizes according to a philosophic life. Interpretation of Homer changes, obviously, over the course of Neoplatonism. The last Neoplatonists were eager to totally reconcile Homer with the Platonic worldview, and they read the Odyssey as a kind of, mystagogic initiation into the philosophic life. But I should wonder if Homer is not sufficient for these things, but Critias is, or Hermocrates, and should be thought to speak about them. Right. So Proclus's refutation of this idea is that Homer is not good enough to talk about these things. Is that okay? Well, is Critias, is Hermocrates, because that's what Socrates is saying. It appears, therefore, to me that Plato divides poetry into the divinely inspired and the artificial. And having made this division, he refers the magnificent diction and sublimity derived from inspiration to the gods. Right. And in the Ion, which we just heard mentioned a little while ago, not by Proclus, but by Wikipedia, when I looked up the Menexenus, the Ion deals with how this character, Ion, is an expert in Homer and can explain, interpret, and recite Homer, but he's no good with the other poets. And Socrates says that's because you don't have science of poetry. You are under the inspiration of the muse that inspired Homer, and that is a kind of chain that runs through the poet, through the director and actors and musicians down to the audience ultimately. And so the interpreter of Homer is like one step in that ladder. And it's kind of an imitation, but the artificial like poet who knows his science is dealing with more of that artificial imitation, perhaps. In the Phaedrus, Socrates says that he who tries to enter into the gates of poetry or music generally with no inspiration but only the science will not be admitted. So maybe Plato is talking about like the lower human poetry, which is mere imitation as opposed to divinely inspired poetry. For oracles, in a remarkable degree, possess grandeur, vehemence, and magnificence of language, but he evinces that the poetry proceeding from human art is not adequate to the praise of the fortitude of this city, and of the great deeds of the men that are educated in it. For if there is any artificial sublimity in some one of the poets, it has much of contrivance in it, and grandeur of diction, and makes great use of metaphors, as is the case with Antimachus. But Socrates requires a panegyrist who exhibits in his praise a spontaneous sublimity, and a magnificence of language which is free from compulsion and pure, just as actions in his Republic have magnificence not casually, but adapted to the education and discipline of the men. That Socrates, however, does not reject the divinely inspired poet, nor the whole of poetry, but that only which is artificial he manifests, I think, when he says, quote, that he does not despise the poetic genus. The poetic genus, therefore, is divine, as he elsewhere says, but he despises the imitative species of poetry, nor yet this simply, but that which is nourished in depraved manners and laws. Karnak?
So just like a recap from the Republic, he talks about banning the poets, and his reasoning for wanting to do that was that they were portraying the gods as being not only good, and also that they were portraying the gods as changing. And, in Homer, obviously the gods are like warring and doing stuff that might not be totally good. So that was something that happened in the Republic. Also, this battle between narration and imitation, where he's talking to someone, I can't remember who in the Republic, but he says like, what's the best way to be, and they claim it's like to imitate the highest good, and Socrates seems to disagree with that, and being spontaneous and having that narration, I guess that's divinely inspired, is what I'm getting from this, is actually the best way to be good.
Okay. So imitation implies like artificial affectation, where you learn something and then enact it yourself through your own powers, whereas Plato is saying the higher form is to be directly inspired by the source and then to act kind of spontaneously with it. Which, jives with his comments on the Phaedrus as well. Proclus, in his essays on the Republic, addressing that banning of the poets, will say that, in Homer, the gods are depicted as changing, etc., and that's only a problem for those who are uneducated in the mysteries. And so, actually, Homer should not be read by the general public, but should be reserved for those who are going through mystic initiation, where they can see the analogical signification of the conflict and of the change. Like Proclus does say, Homer, there is a place for it, but Socrates is afraid of everyone having access to those concepts because they're going to profane them. So rather than downplaying Homer, it's like Homer is the pearls that shouldn't be given away to swine. Okay. For this, in consequence of verging to things of a less excellent nature, is not naturally adapted to be imitative of more exalted manners, and thus much in answer to the doubt. And I lost track of the thread here, so let me just read again. We're going to start back here. The poetic genus, therefore, is divine, as he elsewhere says, but he despises the imitative species of poetry, nor yet this simply, but that which is nourished in depraved manners and laws. For this, in consequence of verging to things of a less excellent nature, is not naturally adapted to the imitative of more exalted manners, or to be imitative of more exalted manners, and thus much in answer to the doubt. Okay, so it's a particular kind of poetry that Socrates has a problem with. The last part, however, of the words of Socrates, being in a certain respect difficult, may be rendered perspicacious as follows. Perspicuous is clearly perceivable, whereas perspicacious is you are perceptive of what's around you. Perspicuous applies to the object, perspicacious to the subject. All right, you gotta love this. 19th century language? The last part, however, of the words of Socrates, being in a certain respect difficult, may be rendered perspicuous as follows. But the words are, quote, that which is foreign to the education of any one, it is difficult to imitate well in deeds, and still more difficult in words. Proclus, for it seems to be easy to imitate words or deeds. Not a few, therefore, act sophistically by exhibiting virtue as far as words, but in deeds being entirely alienated from it. So why then is it more difficult in words if in practice it's easier to say what is virtuous than to do what is virtuous? Will it not, therefore, be better to interpret these words thus, viz., to suppose the most excellent education is implied in the words that which is foreign to the education of any one, but to assume in deeds and in words as equivalent to conformably to deeds and conformably to words, and to imitate well as having the same meaning with to be well imitated. So he's reinterpreting the passage to give a reading that to him makes more sense. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe another possible implication, rather than reinterpreting the passage, why would deeds be easier? Well, if we're talking about what is necessary is a spontaneous enactment of this divine inspiration, then maybe acting in a divinely inspired way is easier than speaking in a divinely inspired way. That actually seems pretty natural to me, but all right, and thus we may collect from all these that for that which is most excellent to be well imitated, it is difficult indeed according to deeds. But it is still more difficult for it to be well imitated according to words in a written work. For this is the thing proposed to be effected in poetry, and you may see how this accords with things themselves. For he who in a written work narrates the deeds of the most excellent men composes a history, but he who narrates the speeches of these men, if he intends to preserve the manners of the speaker, assumes a disposition similar to the speaker. For words are seen to differ according to the inward dispositions. For thus we deride most of those, except Plato, who have written the Apology of Socrates, as not preserving the Socratic manner in their composition. Though the narration of this very thing, that Socrates was accused, made an apology, and was sentenced to die, would not be thought worthy of laughter, but the dissimilitude of imitation in the composition renders the imitators ridiculous. Since also, to say of Achilles that he came forth armed after such a manner, and that he performed such deeds, is not difficult, but to narrate copiously what he said when detained in the river is not easy. But this is the province of one who is able to assume the manners of the hero, and to write conformably to what he would have said. Okay, interesting. Actually, I think that my interpretation is better than this, that I just gave, as to why to write is more difficult correctly than to act. He's saying that you have to assume the manner of the hero, internalize like what it's like to be that character who has the virtue or education. So that's more difficult. All right. This also is evident from Socrates in the Republic, very much blaming Homer respecting the imitation of words. But as to the gods, it is said to be easy by language to imitate the words or deeds of the gods. For who can delineate their works according to their desert? Or it may be said that it is the same thing with respect to the gods, to imitate their words or deeds. For since their words are intellections, and their intellections are productions, the imitator of their words is also the imitator of their productions, so that by how much he fails in the one, by so much also is he deficient in the imitation of the other. Longinus, however, has the following doubts with respect to the proposed words. For if poets are not worthy imitators of the works pertaining to such a city as this, because they are not educated in the manners of the city, neither will Critias and his associates be able to effect this. But neither did they live performing the office of magistrates in it. For neither did they live. Okay, but if it is because they have not science, but are imitators alone, why, by receiving types from us, may they not be able to imitate, since they possess an imitative power? Okay, so maybe the hearers are rendered appropriate because they have just heard the archetype, whereas strangers haven't heard, the other poets haven't heard Socrates' ideal city. Interesting. In answer to these doubts, it may be said that the imitation of such a polity proceeds through a life concordant with its paradigms. For he who does not live according to virtue is incapable of adducing words adapted to worthy men. It is not, therefore, sufficient merely to hear what form of life the polity possesses in order to imitate it, as the doubt of Longinus says it is. Okay, so he's addressing his own prior interpretation of the phrase, saying to really give the words of the worthy man, you have to have lived that education, lived that virtue. And so in that sense, the living of the virtue comes first, and so the deeds are prior. It's actually compatible with the interpretation I mentioned, where to act in an inspired way is easier than to speak in an inspired way. In order to imitate it, as the doubts Longinus says it is. But Porphyry adds that as all things, such for instance as the diurnal light, are not imitated by painters, so neither is the life of the most excellent polity imitated by poets, in consequence of transcending their power. Okay. Moving on, next quote. But with respect to the tribe of sophists, though I consider them as skilled both in the art of speaking and in many other beautiful arts, yet as they have no settled abode, but wander daily through a multitude of cities. Okay, so this is why I kind of wondered earlier why Proclus mentioned in connection with the sophists that they have these beautiful powers but are indigent. It's because he was basically paraphrasing this quote from Plato. From Plato / Socrates. But wander daily through a multitude of cities, I am afraid lest with respect to the institutions of philosophers and politicians, they should not be able to conjecture the quality and magnitude of those concerns, which wise and politic men are engaged in with individuals in warlike undertakings, both in deeds and words. Yeah, so the sophists can't do it because they don't know what it's even like to live in a city or govern a city, because they're wanderers. With respect to the sophists, some of them frequently pretended to be skilled in astronomy, others in geometry, others in politics, and others in the art of dividing. Hence they are now said to be skilled in many beautiful arts. So maybe Socrates is being ironic in that, but there are other instances where Socrates does genuinely appreciate some of the things that the sophists do. He sends people to sophists sometimes, especially Proclus, who's the Hippias, for basic things like arithmetic, etc., or grammar with Proclus. Hence they are now said to be skilled in many beautiful arts. Since, however, they did not possess a scientific knowledge of these, it is added that they are skilled in them. Okay. So like he calls rhetoric a kind of habit, not a science, So he's calling sophistry generally, a skill or a knack rather than a science. For skill manifests an irrational occupation in mere words, unaccompanied with the knowledge of the why. Because, however, and that's also the contention in the Gorgias that Socrates offers, that to really know something, you have to know what should be done and why it should be done. You have to know the good in what is being done. Not just how it works, but what you should do also. So that's a further contention from the Gorgias. Because, however, they not only lived at different times in different cities, but were full of deception, of false opinion, and unscientific wandering, they are justly called wanderers. But as they led a disorderly and inerudite life, energizing according to passion, they are very properly said not to have a settled abode, since it is requisite that every one should arrange himself prior to other things. For all such particulars as are in a family and a city are likewise in manners, and these prior to externals ought to be fitly governed. Get your own house in order before you go out and try to change others. Remove the beam from your own eye. Who then are the proper imitators of the deeds and words of the best polity, if neither the poets nor the sophists are? They are such as are both politicians and philosophers, for the union of both these is necessary in order that through the political character they may be able to perceive the works of the citizens, but through the philosophic their words, in consequence of inwardly pre-assuming their life. And through the former, indeed, they comprehend their practical wisdom, but through the latter, the intellectual energy of the rulers. But from these images we should make a transition to demiurgic causes, for it is necessary that these also should be total and intellectual in order that the universe may be consummately perfect, and that generation may possess, ironically, such things as the heavens primarily contained. I feel like that should say iconically rather than ironically. I'm assuming, yes, that should say iconically, in fact. Next quote. The genus, therefore, of your habit remains, which at one and the same time participates of both these, by nature and by education. Okay. The genus of your habit, as in Timaeus and presumably Critias and Hermocrates. If I recall correctly, it does sound like Socrates does say, like, you guys are the only ones fitting by your character. And Critias is like a political figure. He was a member of the 30 Tyrants. Hermocrates is mentioned as having governed in his home country, as well as Timaeus. So what they have in common is that they're kind of, quote-unquote, the philosopher kings. Critias, in other dialogues, we know was interested in both philosophy and politics. Okay, Longinus, not disdaining to survey these words, and those that precede them, says that in that part of them beginning with, quote, but with respect to the tribe of sophists, I am afraid, as they are wanderers, etc., there is a difference of expression through the desire of dignity and gravity in the diction, that in the words that follow, quote, lest with respect to the institutions of philosophers and politicians, they should not be able to conjecture the quality and magnitude of those concerns, etc., there is a distortion of phrase from what is natural, and that the third part, the genus therefore of your habit remains, etc., is perfectly unusual. For it is not at all dissimilar to the strength of Heracles to Iege is telemaxio, the sacred strength of Telemachus, and other such like expressions. Okay, so in this sequence of phrases from Socrates, we go from more natural and ordinary language to something very unusual, like this phrase that we see from Homer. But it's not explained exactly why. I I guess because you're ascending to the type that really is fit, and so it goes like poetical. And there are other times when Socrates kind of waxes poetical as he's talking about a graver subject matter. So, okay. But Origen admits that the form of expression in the proposed words is conformable to the manner of historians, for such like paraphrases are adapted to a narration of this kind as well as to poetry. We, however, say that Plato everywhere changes his mode of diction so as to be adapted to his subjects, and in unusual things studies mutations of expression. But we do not admit that the proposed words are a periphrasis, for they do not manifest the same thing as the expression, you like the strength of Heracles, from which there would only be an ability of giving that which is adapted to the imitation of the best polity. For those who are both philosophers and politicians, by energizing according to the habit which they possess, and which differs from the poetical and sophistical habit, will be able to effect that which Socrates desires. And thus much for the words themselves. Looking, however, to the conceptions which they contain, we must say that Socrates excites Critias and Hermocrates to what remains to be accomplished in the polity, but he likewise calls on Timaeus to assist the undertaking. And this is the fifth head of the things proposed for elucidation. You may also see how magnificently Socrates celebrates the men from the very beginning, calling the wisdom which they possess a habit, in order that he may exempt them from sophistical wandering. But he says that they are partakers of the political science, both by nature and education, in order that you may contradistinguish it from poetical imitation, which is nourished by less excellent laws. And he designates the perfect from nature and education, lest depriving nature of education, you should cause it to be lame, or you should think that education ought to be thrown into an unapt and incongruous recipient. And thus much has been said in common respecting the men. But if you wish to speak, proceeding to paradigms, the demiurgic genus, which is total and intellectual, remains to be arranged according to a providential attention to wholes. Let us, however, survey separately each particular. Right? So he's kind of foreshadowing some of the stuff that he wants to address coming up. And we can keep going for a little while. Next quote. For Timaeus here of Locris, an Italian city, governed by the best of laws, exclusive of his not being inferior to any of his fellow citizens in wealth and nobility, has obtained in his own city the greatest honors and the highest posts of government, and in my opinion has arrived at the summit of all philosophy. Proclus, what testimony, therefore, can be more admirable than this, or what praise can be greater? Does it not, in the first place, evince that Timaeus was a political character, in the second place, that he possessed intellectual knowledge in a most eminent degree, by saying that he had arrived at the summit of all philosophy, and adding, in my opinion, which places a colophon on the panegyrics? Okay, I don't know what a colophon is, so let's look that up. Colophon. A statement at the end of a book, typically with a printer's emblem giving information about its authorship and printing. Interesting. Maybe, what's the etymology? So the Greek term colophon, summit or finishing touch. Okay. Okay. So in... the finishing touch, he prefaces with, in my opinion, which is even today like a common rhetorical phrase, like give a bunch of compliments and then give the highest compliment prefaced with, in my opinion, just so that, you know, I guess you're downplaying or like disclosing that like it's such a high praise that you don't know for sure if the person is worthy of it, and so you preface it with, in my opinion. All right, but what other image also than this among men is more capable of being assimilated to the one demiurge? For in the first place, so justifying his interpretation of the character metaphors, for in the first place, by the political and the philosophic, the image is Jovian, Zeusian, and Zeus is the demiurge for Proclus. In the next place, by asserting that Timaeus belonged to a city governed by the best of laws, it imitates the god who was nurtured in the intelligible by Adrastia. All right, we're going to have to look up Adrastia. I think we already looked up Adrastia. Wasn't Adrastia the goddess responsible for fate? Yeah, goddess of inevitable fate, pressing necessity. So nurtured in the intelligible by Adrastia. There are two kinds of fate I've mentioned before: Hymarmene, the lower fate, dealing with the physical, and then Ananke, necessity, the higher, quote unquote fate, or necessity more properly. So Adrastia is a goddess presiding over fate, but maybe even over necessity. So the place of Adrastia in Proclus's theology, I'm not totally sure about. We'll keep an eye out for that. But it's significant that Zeus is nurtured by Adrastia, which implies that Adrastia is not just goddess of the lower fate, Hymarmene, but is also even over necessity itself. Definitely must be superior to Zeus in some significant respect if the demiurge is like nurtured in the intelligibles by her. And by Timaeus, excelling in nobility of birth, it adumbrates the total, intellectual, and unical nature of the god. For all of these the demiurge possesses, by participating of the fathers prior to himself, by asserting also that Timaeus had obtained. So, of course, the Zeusian demiurge takes the intelligibles that he takes, I guess, through the nurture of Adrastia, which makes sense that the forms being necessary are distributed to all the intelligible and intellectual gods by necessity, by Adrastia, nurtured in it. All right. But also he takes these forms from Kronos. Kronos is like immediately prior to Zeus, and represents. So just to get it technically correct so that I'm saying it, because this is my understanding of Proclus's theology. So we have in the second hypostasis generally being, life, and then intellect. That intellect is divided into three phases within intellect. There's like the intelligible intellectual, the intelligence and intellectual, intelligent and intellectual, and then the intellective intellectual. So the intelligible intellectual is like the being phase of intellect in the second hypostasis. The intelligent intellectual is like the life phase, and then the intellectual or intellective intellectual phase that's the demiurge. So he's not just the intellectual phase as in being, life, intellect. He is intellect. He's beneath that. There's a trinity in intellect, and he is the last member of that trinity, sort of the intellectual within the intellectual. Kronos is the abiding phase, and I think the intermediary there is Rhea, who is like the life phase of intellect, disseminating those intelligible intellectuals that are gathered together in Kronos. Yeah, I mean, tracking like Proclus's entire system is probably not necessary to understand Plato, but you do have to remember these specifics if you're gonna get everything you can from Proclus. And since Proclus is like the best interpreter of Plato overall, and we have the most material from him, kind of means to know Plato you do have to memorize all of Proclus's minute details for his theology, but sorry about that. For all these the demiurge possesses by participating of the fathers prior to himself. By asserting also that Timaeus had obtained the highest posts of government, it represents to us the royal power of the demiurge, and which has dominion over wholes, his scepter, according to theologists, consisting of 24 measures. Okay. Probably just a reference to 24 hours in a day, I'm guessing. All right. But to add likewise that he had enjoyed And, by the way, just like think about the myth, the kind of Orphic myth of Kronos consuming his children, Zeus slaying Kronos and assuming his role as kind of monarch. So Zeus, even though he's inferior to Kronos, ends up kind of taking the ruling power over the cosmos. But also think from the statesman that the Cronian age, when Kronos was actually in charge, was a golden age. So it's kind of interesting that Kronos is represented as a kind of nefarious character in the myth at base value, but actually symbolizes the containing of all of the intellective and cosmic gods in himself, whereas the Zeusian power is more ruling and therefore more distributed. So Kronos, by eating his children, that's like a symbol of how the intelligible intellectual god contains everything in himself. Not that Zeus doesn't contain everything in himself, but it's a matter of degrees. The Zeusian power is more the ruling power. All right, and his scepter consists of 4 and 20 measures. For what's that? For whatever that is worth. But to add likewise that he had enjoyed the greatest honors presents us with an image of that transcendency which is exempt from wholes, both in dignity and power. So there's the whole that is prior to parts, and that's what he's talking about, exempt from wholes. There's the whole that is in a part, the whole of composed of parts, and then the whole that is prior to parts, the forms or wholes that are prior to parts. And so that greatest honor shows that he is the demiurge of wholes, the whole that is prior to parts. Whereas maybe the intellective demiurge, the member of the demiurgic trinity, would be more the whole of parts, or something like that. Both in dignity and power. It is the demiurge, therefore, who also distributes honors to others, and it may be said that the assertion that Timaeus had arrived at the summit of philosophy assimilates him to the god, who at once perfectly contains all knowledge in himself, so that from all that has been said, you may apprehend, as from images, who the demiurge of the universe is, that he is an intellectual comprehensive of many intellects, and arranged among the intellectual gods. That he is full of the first intelligibles, and that he has a royal establishment, as surpassing in dignity the other demiurgic gods. If, however, Plato calls the city of Timaeus Locris, it is not being usual with the Greeks thus to denominate it, but to call it Locri only, in order to distinguish it from the Locris opposite to Euboea, which we must not wonder. Okay, so why he uses a different term, Locris, rather than Locri, it's to not confuse it. Okay. Oh, so the usual title was Locris, but there's another city called Locris, and so Plato calls it Locri. But all right. For Plato changes many things for the purpose of signifying in a clearer manner the thing proposed. But that the Locrians were governed by the best laws is evident, for their legislator was Zaleucus. I'm going to look up Zaleucus. Lawgiver of Locris. There's a Wikipedia page we could look at. Why not? Let's just read it. A Pythagorean philosopher, so makes sense. According to the Suda, he was previously a slave and a shepherd, and after having been educated, he gave laws to his fellow citizens. Some sources make him a Pythagorean philosopher, although older ones put him as older than Pythagoras or even deny his existence altogether. They also attribute divine origin to his laws. Most probably he devised the first written European law code, the Locrian Code, in the 7th century BC. The code, however, is lost except for some later mentions and imitations which seem clearly anachronistic. Interesting. I kind of want to read a little bit more. A freeborn woman, so this is like a quote from the laws, given by Diodorus Siculus. A freeborn woman may not be accompanied by more than one female slave unless she is drunk. She may not leave the city during the night unless she is an adulteress. She may not wear gold jewelry as a garment with a purple border unless she is a courtesan, and a husband may not wear a gold-studded ring or a cloak of Milesian fashion unless he is bent upon prostitution or adultery. So it's funny, it's not like forbidding them, it's just like, hey, if you wear this, you're a whore, which is funny. It also banned the drinking of undiluted wine except for medical purposes. Okay. Although the Locrian Code distinctly favored the aristocracy, Zaleucus was famous for his conciliation of societal factions. No other fact of his life are at all certain. According to legends, he punished adultery with the forfeiture of sight. When his own son was condemned of this, he refused to exonerate him, instead submitting to the loss of one of his own eyes instead of exacting the full penalty of the culprit. Another law that he established forbade any from entering the Senate House armed. All right. Faced with an emergency, he did so anyway, but when he was reminded of the law, he immediately fell upon his sword as a sacrifice to the sovereignty of the claims of social order. A similar story is told of Charondas. Anyone who proposed a new law or the alteration of one already existing had to appear before the citizens' council with a rope round his neck. If the council voted against the proposal, the proposer was immediately strangled. That like practice of putting your life on the line for the sake of a new law, I think I remember that from the Pythagorean source book as a Pythagorean practice. But I've definitely run across it before. Interesting, though. All right. I'd say we should stop for today. And this was good. Proclus's, metaphorical reading of the characters, he is so thorough with it that it is like, it makes you kind of believe. I still don't really know if Plato intended this particular symbology or that Plato ever thought of a demiurgic triad. But, you have to give credit to Proclus for being so consistent in the interpretation and giving, detailed textual evidence to back up his interpretation. So even if we don't agree with Proclus, we can still admire his method and learn how to be as systematic in our own interpretations. So, okay. Any last thoughts on the reading today? Then, all right, I will pick back up sometime. Again, I'm doing these whenever I can. We're trying to get through it as quickly as possible, and then we'll move on to the Parmenides commentary, with or without reviewing the dialogue of the Timaeus itself. That'll remain to be seen, but